All right, so last week we let's see, where did we end up? Did we finish up the four images?
I think we were still in the legal image, or we were wrapping that up. Maybe.
Did we get? Trying to remember.
I think.
One day I will mark. No, you know why I don't mark? Because I don't have a pencil with me.
We're ready
Here's a
to
yellow
start
one, you'll not be
number
able to see
3
it.
there,
Oh, yeah.
God versus the gods.
God versus the gods. Okay, yeah, maybe that's right.
All right.
All right, so we talked about the four models.
yeah.
Right, I think we did. That do come from the Bible. All right, and those were the financial image, the military image, the sacrificial image, and the legal image. And remember, as Guthrie stated, all of these images, you know, they each have their pros and they each have their cons. There are images that Guthrie likes better than the others. But even the ones he does like, remember, he says if you push them too far, they unravel.
Right.
Especially which one? I remember as he was talking about the one about debt. You know, who do you owe the debt to?
Right.
You know, once you push that too far, it starts to unravel.
Right.
So he says, you know, these images have their positives, but they also have their negatives. So, you know, you kind of have to look at it in the context of almost all four of them, you know, as you begin to look at them. All right, so we are now on God versus the gods, plural, and I'm going to go ahead and read a section on Guthrie, smaller section. One way to get at the meaning of the doctrine of the atonement in the biblical religion is to contrast it with what atonement or reconciliation meant in other ancient religions, and still means in some modern versions of them. People in the ancient world lived in terror before gods, who were easily offended by disrespect and disobedience, and quick to seek revenge and retribution. In order to live in peace and prosperity, people had to do what they could to appease, placate, or satisfy the angry gods. Prayers, good deeds, and above all, sacrifices were the means by which they sought to ease their guilty consciences, atone for their sins, and win the approval of the gods. These religious rituals and moral achievements were also ways of manipulating the gods into giving people supernatural help. What their gods thought of them and how their gods acted toward them depended upon what the people or priestly representative did to butter them up or buy them off. Sometimes this cost people a great deal, but with their piety and sacrifices, they paid the price and they won the salvation. It was basically do-it-yourself religion. What's a DIY now?
Yeah.
You see it all over the place, right? Do-it-yourself religion. The situation of estrangement and need for reconciliation we have described is not strange to us. That is why biblical religion can be so easily twisted into superstitious primitive paganism in our time too. But the God of the Bible is different from the gods, and that's lowercase g, and the Christian doctrine of atonement is different from what we have just described. We see the difference when we look at the character of the God we meet in the history of Israel, and above all in Jesus Christ. Or to put it in terms of the Church's doctrine of the Trinity, we seek the difference when we remember the Trinitarian rule that works of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit cannot be separated or set in opposition to each other. For what one wills and does, the others will and do also. And that goes back to chapter 5, which was the doctrine of the Trinity when we worked on that. All right, so we think about God versus the gods, right? And so Guthrie gave an example of how atonement was viewed in the ancient world. So remember, Israel in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures, and Israel or Palestine in the New Testament, you know, remember, they are surrounded by what?
Pagans.
Pagans, yeah, other tribes.
Tribes.
They're surrounded by, if you go back to the Hebrew Scriptures, they're surrounded by, numerous tribes, right? They might have carved themselves out a piece, the promised land, but it doesn't mean that they're not still surrounded by other tribal peoples. They are surrounded by other tribes. In the New Testament, they're surrounded by other provinces, right? Roman provinces. And they are also a Roman province, right? Anyone who lives within the grasp of Rome becomes a province, pretty much, right? So they don't exist by themselves. They have their own existence, but remember, they are continually in contact with their neighbors. So whether it be warfare, whether it be intermarriage, whether it be commerce and trade, or just getting along or not getting along, you cannot exist in your own bubble. You can't. Not when you're surrounded by other people. And so Guthrie says, we must look at how atonement is viewed from the outside. How did the other tribes do it? Right? How did the other peoples do it? And what are some examples he gave?
Sacrifices.
Yeah, they do sacrifices. And how were the gods seen by the people?
Full of wrath.
Yeah, wrath, anger, sometimes rage, sometimes happy. And we even joke about it. Like we joke, it's like, oh my gosh, like if you're having really bad weather, you're like, oh, someone's really angry. We even say, to kids, when there's a thunderstorm, God's angry, or God's bowling, or, the angels are bowling. We come up with, little cute little sayings. But in the ancient world, the gods, the pagan gods were some beings to be appeased. If things are going well, then the gods are happy. If things are not going well, gods are not so happy. And they typically take it out on people, right?
Right.
And so you can even see that in how some of the ancient peoples viewed the afterlife. If you had a decent existence, the afterlife is this kind of happy thing. And if you had, I want to say I don't know, I'm trying to remember if it was the Mesopotamians, one of the earliest of the civilizations within that region of the world, like their understanding of the afterlife was absolutely scary. And I think that's because life on this earth was very harsh. And so it was thought, well, the next world is just a continuation, It's like the beating continues, just in a different form now. And so, that impacts that. And so people lived in terror. People, would have to placate gods. Some gods were seen as angry gods. Some gods were more happy than others. But, when you dealt with different pantheons, you were the ones who manipulated them, right?
Right.
It's almost like, well, they're gods, but humans have the ability to manipulate. Or that's how they
Try to,
understood
at
it,
least,
or
right.
tried to manipulate, by sacrificing, right? Or by building another temple, right? Or taking care of this temple, or offering grain to this temple, or an animal sacrifice, cleaning the temple. I mean, there were all different ways to
But
do
this
it.
actually includes, I would say, the Israelites.
I think so too.
Yeah.
In ways, I think the
pre-
Israelites, yeah.
We were talking about
Yeah.
how they're different than their neighbors, but they definitely were all about the sacrifices and temples and,
Yeah. Yes. Good.
Job aside, there's definitely a big thing of, you get what you deserve based on your piety or whatever.
Based on your actions. Yeah. Think about when we studied 1st, 2nd Samuel and 1st, 2nd Kings, especially when you move into Kings. We see this good king, bad king, good king, bad king, and after a while, God is like that. I'm done.
Right.
I'm done. No more kings. In fact, no more you. It's like this king does great, but decides to leave the high places there. Like, it's, and it was a rarity when you had a king who did everything right. But yeah, and a lot of things at the Hebrew, and remember, the Hebrew concept of religion, it morphs over time. I don't know if you want to use the term modernizes, but it's this continual movement, right? It's this, God wanted to have a different relationship with God's people, and so there's this movement away from how the Hebrews understood God, or how the external tribes around the Hebrews understood God. Because
Yeah,
Jesus
they were-
comes and things then turn very different,
Right.
right?
Right. But
It's
they
no-
were distinct from the other groups before that. I don't mean to
No, you're right. They were just
overemphasize their similarities
But-
at the expense of their differences.
right, but they were similar in many ways. Like, for instance, their understanding of God was very territorial, just like their neighbors. And they don't have this understanding yet that God is everywhere. There might be some Jews that have that idea, but remember when the Jews, especially the ones in Judah, that are carted off after the Babylonian destruction of Judah and the temple. They're carted off. Some are dropped off in different places, and many are brought to Babylon. And there, by the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, we get these powerful images of a people that felt defeated. And one of the reasons is they felt so defeated is they are there, and where is their God?
Back in Judea.
Back in Judah, back in
Right.
Judea, back home. God's back home, we're here, now stuck with their God that we don't like. We don't want to be around him. We don't want to be around their people, right? So yes, it is this cause for alarm. And, so this concept that God is everywhere develops. Think about when Jesus is meeting with the woman at the well, right? In the 4th chapter of John.
Right.
And, she says, look, we worship here, you people worship in Jerusalem. What's the answer? She asks wonderful questions, actually. Great questions. I mean, you think about some of the questions this woman asks, and it's, Jesus answers them and answers questions that we ask. Answers questions that keep us from saying, well, what is God? Because whenever we say, what is God, and we say God is spirit, that's Jesus' response to her. So she doesn't like beat around the bush. I mean, she asks some really deep theological questions, and which you say, kudos, fantastic, good for you. You had the Son of God in front of you, and you asked him some hard questions. I love it, right? So when Jesus responds, soon you'll be able to worship God wherever you are. Because God is spirit. There is no right or wrong place. It's every place. God is everywhere. So when you think about it, it's this continual movement into how we understand God now in the postmodern world. You just don't go from 0 to 60 overnight. It's not like a blink. It's this process. And so what Andy said is correct. Because even though God wants it to be different, the Hebrew people are still people, right? Even though they are the separated people, the chosen people by God, they still live like their neighbors. They still want what their neighbors have. They want how they have. And so, sometimes God gives it to them like that. That's what you want? You want a king? Fantastic. I'll give you the king you want, you dream of. Here's Saul. He's beautiful, tall, handsome, strong. Is that the king they needed? No. But it's the king they wanted. Because they wanted the king that stood head and shoulders above all, just like everyone else did. They wanted that kind of a king. But what they needed was a king like David, whose, appearance was not like Saul's, but he was gutsy. Did he screw up? Most definitely, just like everyone else. But he was the leader that they needed. So when we think about God versus the gods, and I love how he said, and this is great how he said, do it yourself, because this term was definitely not as popular as it is today. that whole DIY, the do-it-yourself. We see it in texts. We see it all over the place. And I think,
Song by Peter Gabriel.
yeah, this predates that. I think this book was done when? In the 60s?
Okay.
No, maybe 70s.
Yeah,
Let's
I think
see. When was Gabriel's song?
Gabriel's song was in the 70s.
70s. This book, that's quoting the Bible, so I can't use those. Nope. Well, this is a new printing. It has 94, but this was a lot older than
Does it
94.
say first edition in there somewhere? Or first printing?
Well, I have his first printing in my office, and it is definitely not 94. This was done in 94, but the earlier printings are very early.
74?
If I were to guess, I would guess 70s. I don't know who borrowed it from who. Did he borrow it from? Did he even know who Peter Gabriel was? So anyway, so this do-it-yourself, and so why does he call it do-it-yourself?
78.
78.
Yeah. It was with Peter Gabriel. I don't know about the book.
Yeah. Why does Guthrie call these religions do-it-yourself?
It's all about works,
And who's doing the works?
people.
The people
Right.
are doing the works. Right. Now, in some ways, piggybacking off of what Andy had mentioned earlier, in some ways, this is why sometimes people will look at the Hebrew religion and say, well, it is works-based. You're making sacrifices, right? And it takes some of the authors within the New Testament to say, well, works are being done, but it's still by faith, right? Abraham moved by faith. Moses moved by faith. Joshua moved by faith. But there are some things that have to be done. With Israel's neighbors, they call it a do-it-yourself religion, right? You buy off the gods. You're buttering up the gods. And I think we see in some ways these lines get crossed because this is what boils down sometimes to because the Jewish people mucked up society so bad at points that how do you fix it? When you look at books like Kings and you have pagan religions running rampant all over Israel, you have to destroy these places. And that's what they do. But some people leave things, right? Or it's when they don't follow what God wants, then you have to go in there with a cleanup crew, right? Saul, God gives Saul specific instructions what to do, and he doesn't, and that angers God, All right, so the situation of estrangement and need for reconciliation we have described is not strange to us, and that is why biblical religion can be easily twisted into superstitious, primitive paganism in our time, too, right? So it's not just, we can't just say, oh, look at them, look at how they screwed things up, because we can do the same thing. Guthrie says we must understand it in light of the Trinitarian God. But how do we understand it? We must understand it that all three, right, they all experience, they all do, they are all the same. So when one does something, they all do it. When one experiences pain, they all experience pain, right? It's not a pantheon of three gods that hang out, right? It's one God within three different persons who experiences the pain, experiences joy, experiences worship. But it's one God, and we must understand it as that. So to move further to the love of God, it is not the guilty, but the injured that makes the initial move. Christians also know that sinful human beings are alienated from God. It is our fault. We have disobeyed God's commandments. Even worse, we have ignored or rejected God's love. But strangely enough, it is not the guilty, but the injured party who acts to restore the broken relationship. God does not demand that we first do something to make up for what we have done or not done before God reluctantly agrees to forgive us and love us again. God makes the first move. Exactly the opposite of the procedure in the pagan religions. It is not God who is reconciled to us, but we who are reconciled to God. It is not we who make peace with God, but God who makes peace with us. This is what the death of Jesus is all about. So when we think about, now fast forwarding from the ancient Hebrews to Israel in the Roman times, right, under the Roman rule, we think about a people now who encounter God in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, right? And so it's not the guilty but the injured that makes the initial move. Because we are broken, God doesn't say, well, clean up. Clean up first, then we'll talk. It's the opposite of that, right? It's God saying, I'll take you as you are. I'll take you as you are. Then we'll get you cleaned up. You know, it's almost like let's get you inside, you know, get a meal inside of you, warm your feet by the fire, and then we'll clean you up. And then we'll work. And then we'll work, right? Again, God makes the first move, exactly the opposite of the pagan procedures, right? And so within the pagan procedures, it's what? It's the people who try to appease God. With our understanding of God through the revelation of Jesus Christ, it's Jesus who makes the first move. Think about Jesus' interactions with people in the New Testament, in the Gospels. You do have people approach Jesus. That does happen. But you also have Jesus approaching people, right? You have Jesus approaching the woman at the well, you know, hey, can you get me a drink of water, right? You have Jesus approaching Zacchaeus. Hey, come down from that tree, Zacchaeus. I'm going to come eat at your house tonight. And it's great because these people are like, yeah, fantastic. It's not like, who are you and why am I going to make a dinner for you? Everyone knew him. So it's like, you want to come to my house? Sweet, you know. I'll get the pots. I'll warm the pots, right? So Jesus is the one that makes the first move, right? Jesus approaches people. Peter, after Peter's total botch job, as he botches this, as he says, I would never deny you, God. I would never deny you, Jesus. And he does. 3 times. Who approaches who to mend the fence? Jesus.
Peter.
Do you love me, Peter? Of course I do, right? And that's why in my heart I feel that if Judas had stuck around, I think that Jesus would approach Judas too. I do. I believe that. I believe it. I believe it with all my heart. Because what, you know, he's asking God, Jesus is asking the Father to forgive the people who nailed him to a cross.
Right.
I mean, so it's like, what sin is so grave that Jesus is not going to be like, hey, you know, of course I'll take you back. You know, do you understand what you did? You know, I mean, so it's kind of like, in my heart, I believe if he stuck around, and I think this is, you know, when you see in the Gospels this interaction, the interactions between Judas and the interactions between Peter, they take this parallel track. Now, Peter is not selling Jesus to the religious leaders. He doesn't do that. But when Peter has the opportunity to stand for him, he doesn't, because he's afraid, right? And so what you see in ways, two denials, or a betrayal and a denial. The difference is Peter sticks around. And Peter is able to be brought back in, but it's Jesus who approaches Peter. Right? It's not the opposite. In some of the pagan religions, it would have had to have been who to move towards who? Peter. Mm-hmm. Peter would have had to find probably the biggest ram or the biggest ox to sacrifice to whatever pagan god he'd have to do it to, right? That's a big one. So, but it's Jesus who moves towards Peter, right? But the beautiful thing is, it's not guilty, but it's injured. We're injured. We're broken, right? But God is the one who takes us as we are. As we are.
So,
And I'm wondering if I wrote this down wrong.
I mean, I guess it's just one of those things that you're not supposed to think or whatever, but so we're the guilty and God is the injured because we have fallen short of the glory of God. But God made us.
Correct.
So when did we choose exactly? And I guess that's just the whole, that's just what it is.
When did we choose what?
To turn against God. I don't remember making that choice.
I think it's
That's just our condition,
I think it's humanity that chose. But that happened a long time ago. And I
Right.
think it is, and yes.
But is it fair for me to be, I'm intentionally asking difficult questions.
No, I think you're no. Listen, this is what theology study is all about.
That's right.
It's all about asking the difficult questions. It's all about the woman saying, "Where do you worship? What say ye, Jesus?" We're supposed to ask difficult questions. And yes, the way I understand it, which is Reformed, is that it's a condition that we all live in. And when you say, well, what, why, or what have I, but you have come to the understanding that this is something you desire, right? And so you're connected, right? You breach that condition, and you are part of the church. I saw an interesting quote the other day, and I'm trying to remember who said it. And it was talking about predestination. And God, for the love of me, I wish I remember who made the quote, because it was a wonderful quote. And it said, predestination is not bad news for those people who are outside of the church. It's good news for the church. It's good news for those who are called. It's never seen as bad news if you are on the outside of it, it's not bad news. It is you are who you are. But as the church, you understand that this is what has called you in to the church. So I think perspective, and I think the reason why I brought that up is perspective. I think perspective is a big thing of it. So however we look at it, and you say, well, it wasn't, hey, I didn't, is it the condition? And I think that is the correct answer from my perspective. Now you can ask a Methodist or a Roman Catholic or an Orthodox or a Baptist, and they might give you a totally different answer, But from my perspective, yes, that is correct, right? It's a broken condition that affects all of creation. Anything that lives, it's affected, right? But you have come to the understanding, right, that you belong to God, right? So despite all of this, despite the condition, despite everything that is screwy with our world, you have made that connection. All of us have, right? We have, even though our journeys are all different, we all have different situations, we all have different experiences, we all have come to this conclusion. And it means something different to each of us, as it's our own spiritual journey. But yeah, because of something else, you had to live in this broken condition, like we all do. Now, just because we're part of the church doesn't mean the broken condition doesn't go away. It just means that now we live, I love the expression, between the tensions. So we are of the world, but we're a part of the world. Right? And that's where the church rests. Because the church is not called to be this,
In the world, not of it.
Right. In the world, but not of it. Right. So, just like some philosophical understandings, we're not meant to be isolated and say, okay, all right, we all know who Jesus is now, so let's build a compound and live out in the wilderness where no one's around us, so we can't be tainted by anything from the outside world. We'll all hang out together. We'll all build a gym in here. We can work out together. We'll build a coffee shop. We can all drink coffee together. We can have restaurants, and we can build dormitories, and the world stays out there and we stay in here, which is so fundamentally against the teachings of Jesus.
Yeah. I think our faith is what enables us to be in the world without being of it.
Correct. And what is our mission is to minister to the world.
Right.
So-
Bring a few more people.
That's right. You can't minister to the world if you're locked away because you don't want to be around it and around the broken condition. Because even in that compound where you're all together, you're all like-minded, so you think, we're all together because we still are broken vessels. And the sinning will be inside there, just like it is outside. Doesn't make a difference if you're a Christian or not. We still are part of this broken condition, but we understand it in a different light. We understand it, we call it out for what it is, and we know the answer of how to maneuver through it, and that's living as Christ taught, right? Living with the Spirit indwelling us, but Christians still do bad things. Christians still make mistakes. We just have a different perspective on things, right? All right, but good question. I love when you ask difficult questions, Andy. That's what makes class
Well, I'll
more
come up with
interesting.
some harder ones.
Yeah, thank you.
That's your homework. Come up with some
Yeah,
questions to stump
thanks.
it.
I'm gonna make you sit in a corner next week. So God makes peace with us, different than the pagan religions. We've already went over that, and the final piece. And I didn't even see this. It's very reformed, because that's who we are, and because we are Reformed theologians. All right, I'm going to read this last section, which will tie the love of God up, and then next week we'll pick up with costly love. So, in summary, in contrast to ancient and modern paganism and Anselm's legalistic view, the biblical doctrine of the atonement teaches that it is God who initiates and fulfills the reconciliation between sinful humanity and God, right? So God is the initiator. God is the subject, not the object, of what happened on Good Friday. God's desire is not to crush us, dirty glasses, with the hammer of God's wrath, so that we have to turn to Jesus to keep God from doing what God would like to do to us. Jesus is himself the coming of God our Savior, who desires everyone to be saved. The death of Jesus for us is God's own action to fulfill that desire. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ. The doctrine of the atonement should awaken in us, first of all, not terror of God's wrath, but joyful thanksgiving for God's love. And that's how Guthrie ends that section. All right? And you think about it, it's just like how we understand the day of resurrection. The day of resurrection also has another name to it. It's known as the day of resurrection, and it's also known as the day of judgment.
Judgment,
Yeah. It's all about your perspective. How do you look at it? How do you view it? Do you view it as God coming back to be with us? God coming back to establish God's kingdom? God coming back that we will be with loved ones and the church will be together and the church will be with God? That sounds pretty wonderful to me. Or do you view it as God coming back to execute judgment on all the ones that scoffed and said, nope, that ain't happening, and I reject this? There are some people who look at it like that, who just salivate at the opportunity to see this, instead of saying, no, that's not how I view it. The way I view it is, God's coming back and I get to be with God. God's coming back and we will all be together. God's coming back and this place will be better eventually, right? And so, again, it's perspective. It's perspective. All right. Next week we will continue.